why don't we
I'd like to open it up.
open it up and and there's Mike and Daniela will give you a microphone and maybe say who you are and.
Oh.
Yeah, stand up, please.
Hi, my name's Evan. I heard a lot of talk on the panel about Hillary Clinton's inevitability. That's actually a similar things I heard back in 2007 when Hillary Clinton was first running for president. And I was wondering if there's I hear a lot of talk on like the left blogosphere of another challenge from the left from an Elizabeth Warren type figure or someone like her to mount a successful challenge for her for the nomination. How likely do you think that will happen? Someone, Elizabeth Warren or someone like her, mounting a successful challenge from the left and robbing Hillary Clinton of her inevitability yet again.
Can I address that? Because I just wrote my column on that this week. It's like you were planted.
And where might we find that column?
Which you can find on cookpolitical.com, where I address all of those questions right to you, Evan. Because I get that question a lot, so that's why I decided to write this. So there are two things, and Mark and I were talking about this on the way in. You know, there's a danger in the business that we are in fighting the last war, which I have to force myself not to do that. Like, well, it didn't work in 2006, it's not gonna work now. Hillary Clinton was inevitable then, she can't, look how that turned out. Look at two things. The first is, if you look at her numbers right now, among liberals, so Pew just came out of the field a couple of weeks ago, and what's great about Pew is that they have data on Hillary Clinton going all the way back to when she was the first lady. Her approval ratings and the interest among liberals for her to run is higher, so like at 87%, than it is among conservative or moderate Democrats, okay? Liberals love her, they want her to run, they think she's awesome. So if you're gonna come from her left, okay, but I don't know where you make that move. In fact, the thing is it's conservatives who are not happy with her. That's where an insurgent could come to her right. The second about inevitability is you go, okay, well, she's now seen as, believe it or not, back when we had the "you're likable enough Hillary" moment, remember, in the New Hampshire debate in 2008, she is more likable now. 51% in 2008 said she was not likable. 36% believe that now about her. So it is a different, perceptions of Hillary Clinton have changed over time, mostly for the better. The one thing that hasn't changed, and this is the threat to her, mostly in a general election, more so than in a primary, is this idea that she's not about new ideas, right? She's been around for 20 plus years. So this goes to the point of who are Republicans gonna put up against her? If you put up a Jeb Bush, you say, well, he comes with many good things, he comes with the baggage of his last name, but mostly what he comes with the baggage of is being a 60-something white guy with the last name Bush, right? That's not exactly saying we're new and we're the new different Republican Party. If you're gonna run against Hillary Clinton, yes, she has vulnerabilities on Benghazi and Secretary of State, but her biggest vulnerability still is gonna be, she's a candidate of the past, who's the candidate for the future? And that's where, if I were Republicans, I would be looking. Anyway, okay. The end.
Yeah, right in front. I'm gonna make you guys, I'm sorry, take that and then here.
What do you think the impact of the number of states that are trying to turn back some of the early voting possibilities, is that going to disenfranchise enough people, a certain segment of the electorate, that can have an impact in 2016?
I think it can have an impact, but what we've often seen is that sometimes when the Republicans or a political party decide, well, let's cut back on early voting, let's institute tougher voter ID laws because we feel like this gives us an advantage against the Democrats, that's often had a negative, that's forced another reaction where Democrats are turning out even more.
Right.
If they feel like that they're being disenfranchised, and so certain segments of the population say, people are trying to screw me over. I have now more incentive to go to the polls, to get my relatives and friends and neighbors to go as well. And we saw, for example, that happen in Florida in 2012, where the Republican governor, Rick Scott, decided to cut back early voting, and you had all of this turnout that benefited Barack Obama in 2012. That's not actually saying, for example, whether this is right or not, or all the political journalists on the stage would tell you straight up front, this is about a party that's in control of things and wanting to be able to win in their state. But I've seen it backfire in the past.
I think
and Joe Lenski, who's one of the great experts on this subject, is here, and he may want to dissent from what I have to say, but I talk about inevitability. One of the things that's clearly happening in the long term is a real long-term trend towards very much more open voting rules. The idea of election day, I think, will vanish over the next few cycles, or I don't know how long this will take. So we're seeing back and forth, and a little retreat and a little forward, but over the next whatever number of elections, the range of options you will have as a voter will be so much greater than they were a few years ago, or that they will be, this November, excuse me. But this September, you'll probably be able to vote for a month, and
That's true.
as is now the case in some countries. So, I think in the long run, we are going to see much, much more open elections.
That's a great point.
Brian, you're here.
Hi, Brian Wade, class of '74, and first, congratulations to Barbara and Lee for a job well done.
You left Marist and I showed up.
Well, hopefully there wasn't some link there. But when you discuss the topics that are likely to influence elections and voters, I think one topic you didn't mention was the media. And so the question is, how influential do you think the media will be? There are some who will say that the media is somewhat biased towards the Democratic Party. So sort of a two-part question. How influential is it, and do you think the media is biased?
I think the biggest influence of the media is on the pessimism, the 65% who don't like Washington. And what Amy was talking about, how Lincoln would get slammed. Actually, Lincoln was slammed, it just wasn't on Twitter.
Right.
He had a lot
He had his detractors.
He had a lot of criticism, pretty vitriolic. But nonetheless, I think it's the cable shout shows that feed this cynicism that immediately everything one president, one party does is automatically bad, right down the line. We didn't used to have that. Sure, we had the gatekeepers of the traditional media, and they were clearly biased to the left, but it was a common filter. And so that's, I think, the instant and enduring effect we have. The media has become more partisan. People watch the media of their choice increasingly to hear their own opinions echoed back at them. I don't like it. I prefer a media that tries at least to aim toward the center, even if we don't always succeed.
So when Lee and I started in this business back in the Buchanan administration,
Phil Moore, I like that.
Phil Moore.
I like that.
So back then, I knew what you meant by the media. I don't even know what the word means anymore. And I think that's the thing that's having the biggest effect on politics, which is the relationship that we, and I actually mean the representatives of sort of institutional news organizations, have to politics is wildly different from what it was even when I started as a political reporter. And Steve Tubman and I are, in fact, in the middle of a big argument with the White House over this very issue. I'll take 1 minute just to tell you what it is. But
Transparency.
Transparency at the White House has become a big issue for us. And the amount of access that journalists get to the president has actually been considerably reduced in this administration. This democratic, open administration actually gives journalists less access than they used to have. And at least part of the reason for that, not the only reason, but part of the reason for that, and I'll use examples from just one part of what we do, but you see a lot of images from the White House every day. And it used to be that most of those images that you saw on any given day were taken by professional journalists, photojournalists who were given some kind of access to the President of the United States. But in this administration, the President and his people have sharply reduced the amount of access that photojournalists have to see the President, and have considerably increased the number of photographs they release by their own government-employed photographers and release through social media.
So when when Obama's on the phone with Putin,
that photograph was taken by a government employee. Okay. So was the picture of the president meeting with the Dalai Lama. Okay. An event that to me seems to be a basic event of the president doing his work on the taxpayers' behalf. And that is all enabled by the way the media has changed. And we'll talk about it from our point of view. We no longer have the ability as gatekeepers, and this may well be a good thing in some larger sense, but in terms of our relationship to politics, a lot less of what you know about politics flows through us. And that's a big change.
I'll give you an example on this photo thing. In the Reagan White House, after he was shot, the White House shot its own photo of him in the hospital, standing with Nancy and the hospital room. They cropped the photo. The one they chose to release did not show all the IV tubes standing right next to him. A photojournalist in the room might have panned the camera a little bit more and shown a little broader view. A year or two ago, the White House released a photo just of a text of a speech and presumably the president's hand editing it line by line. And it went viral. And people were very impressed, millions of people commenting about how brilliant he was. We have no idea, even if that was his hand, let alone whether that was staged.
There's a menu.
You could read the text.
Oh, okay.
You could read, but we don't know that. That was all done for their purposes. You know, they let cameras in. It's not their own camera. Now they have their own video crews, and they call that access. Now, we have a different view based on what the founding fathers thought. The key thing is no one in that room, when it's only the government in place, is asking a question. We will ask questions, whether it's a photojournalist or a reporter, and we're getting a lot less of that.
Here's what I think about the polarization and the media piece is much more the decline of local news and newspapers and news outlets. So when you think about where people are getting their news and what the focus is, it's a DC, New York focus that is very nationalized. These races for Congress used to be all politics is local, and then there would be a national piece, especially if there was some big issue. Now, there are very few outlets left that are covering politics, nonetheless anything else. And so the only thing you know about your member of Congress is they have a D or an R after their name, and you associate that with whatever the national debate is, as opposed to, hey, my local congressman who does these 53 things in our district. There was when you look at how many people are in Washington right now, journalism's doing great. If you're in New York or DC, it's not hard to get a job in different, whatever you want to call them, whether they're true journalism jobs or not, but it's called journalism. If you try to go to the traditional places, the Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle, LA Times, Chicago Sun-Times, those positions aren't there. So we have really, in nationalizing the media, I think we've only helped this polarization.
And just one final point is the entire matter of trust in media too, and of course a lot of it comes in a political lens, and there have been some really big screw-ups in our profession. The overwhelming majority of journalists I find are some of the most honest, most curious people that you would ever encounter in your lifetime. But there is a situation where we're dealing with on trust, and whether it's been other past mishaps or that someone says, I don't believe your poll that has President Obama at 42%. There's another poll out there at 51%. Right. I don't believe what NBC or Fox News or the New York Times or whomever is saying things. And that is a problem because you look back in a time in which, and of course this was well before me, but when Edward Murrow actually said something that actually mattered instead of, God, what a leftist he was. And of course there were, I guess, some people making that argument at that time in the 50s. But it is something that we're having to deal with at a time in which, and it was kind of pointed out that Michael was mentioning, there are so many different media outlets, so many different opportunities for people to have different choices. Someone to say, I like this particular journalist because I trust him. But the overwhelming thing is that when you say, I sometimes hate to get into a taxi cab and actually identify myself as a journalist, one, because the guy might actually hate me, or all he wants to do is talk about politics and I have to answer 3 or 4 phone calls. But trust is a big deal.
Interesting.
When I get in a taxi cab, I just talk about his driving.
Same with third grade teachers.
Yeah, Jim, and then Joan. Yeah, Mike, I'm getting your exercise, aren't you? Jim Daly.
Jim Daly, class of 72 at Marist. You mentioned the Tea Party before, and it sort of becomes this catch-all thing, and it's sort of mud on the Republicans' tires. What mud is on the Democratic Party? Tell me about the environmentalists. No fracking in New York State while it's a boom in the Marcellus Shale throughout the Northeast, Ohio, Pennsylvania. The inability to get the pipeline built. How much power do they have that we're really that's not being advertised? It seems to me they have an awful lot.
Yeah, well, I think that's an important question because clearly there's been polarization in both directions. Mm-hmm. And it's clear that the left is, if not as angry as the right, is pretty angry in a lot of ways right now. And you could actually see today in Washington, there was a hearing the Senate held on the Keystone Pipeline, and it seemed pretty apparent from the way they organized the hearing that the Democrats themselves have become nervous that 5 years of arguing about this pipeline without getting it built is actually become a drag. Right. So I think there is an issue here.
There is, although, you know, the nice thing about being the party in power is those differences tend to get glossed over. When you're a winner, everybody loves everybody. When you lose, that's when you start pointing fingers. I do think you're right, and the Keystone Pipeline is going to be significant in that if you look at the people that give the Democrats their majority in the Senate, they are people from red states, many of them red states that also happen to be big energy producers. So the senators from Montana and North Dakota and Louisiana would love to see the Keystone Pipeline go through.
Yeah, it's
they
actually
would love to see the fracking issue. Democrats get on the right side of this. So this is a challenge for the president. He says we want to keep the Senate in Democratic hands. This is where he's going to have to do this, and liberals are going to be furious.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence that the Keystone Pipeline terminates in Louisiana.
I don't think environmentalists have anywhere near the hold on the Democratic Party that the Tea Party had on the Republican Party, or we would have seen climate legislation, a major push from the White House 4 years ago. Because we hear it every week in Washington from environmental groups. They want it, they've been lobbying it, they meet with the White House, and they're not getting that push that they want.
Joan, did you want to, you had your hand up before. Daniela, could you, you're getting a mic in a second.
If you want to leave the mic with us, we'll.
Do I have to stand up?
No,
No.
you're okay.
Lyndon Johnson did have his bags of cash, and we're horrified to be reminded about that. I read those books too. But now we have Citizens United, and the same bags of cash are floating around, only this time under legal auspices. No one has commented tonight about the role of money in politics today, and I wish you would.
Okay.
Please.
It plays a very big role.
Apparently a popular view.
And the most finance candidate doesn't always win, but you'd always rather have more money than your opponent does. And we talked a little bit about that special congressional election that happened in Florida on Tuesday that Republicans ended up winning. And one of the things that I found really fascinating, the Democratic candidate Alex Sink had a 4-to-1 spending advantage over her Republican candidate David Jolly. But outside groups that had come in, mainly from the Republican side, although there were quite a few Democratic outside groups as well, pretty much made it almost a 1-to-1 where the Democrats had just a little bit more spending advantage. And you can actually look at, and I'm a big believer that when people often see TV ads, as a political scientists often find, don't usually have that much impact unless one side has unilateral control over the airwaves. If somebody is able to say, well, those ads are wrong, or I'm going to tell you why the other candidate's awful and blah, 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 you're able to kind of diffuse it where you even things out. But what the outside groups in this situation have done, and we've seen Democratic outside groups also kind of go in, is that you can kind of reduce something where somebody now doesn't have the overwhelming spending advantage. But I think your question even raises another point, is that who's behind a lot of these groups? And we have seen, and I don't think it should come as any surprise, that wealthy people have often had a very big impact on American elections, even going back to some of the post-Watergate situation where someone could say, well, I'm going to donate $1 million to the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee, and that's my way to kind of influence, even with the campaign contributions that came from the post-Watergate era. But now I do think we've entered a new phase in which if you are a multi-millionaire or multi-billionaire, you can set up your own super PAC, you can get your friends coming in, and you can spend ad upon ad upon ad to try to get your way. And that is a little bit of a different thing. I think money has always been a big role. People have often, very wealthy people have often played roles in American politics, but we've entered a kind of in a new stage.
There's also a big change from the time when money went to a politician to buy a vote to going to local TV stations to buy all the votes. It was probably more effective when it went to 3 or 4 members of a committee in Congress.
Okay, Dennis, a couple more hands. Dennis Johnson, Children's Health Fund.
Thanks, Lee and Barb, and congratulations. I've had the pleasure of working with you guys over the years, and it's just terrific that you're here 35 years, and I hope many more. My question is, I was in D.C. last week at a conference that the Atlantic magazine put on. It was reinventing the war on poverty, revisiting poverty in this country, which many of you know is now at, particularly among children, at unprecedented levels. And I'm wondering what the panel would think about issues. Well, we've talked about economic instability. We're concerned about the generational tensions as we try and decide where the bounty of this nation is going to be expended between generations. And I was like to ask what your thoughts are about how the role of how we address this poverty issue, what role that will play in the upcoming elections.
I think this is a fascinating issue because we're at a moment where it's become acceptable to talk about income inequality as long as we don't actually mention poor people. Okay. And that's really quite a line that politicians are walking right now. Poor people are not popular in this country or in the Western world in general. In fact, you may know this, but in the United Kingdom, one of the most popular reality shows on television is a show about welfare cheats. That's what we would call them. They have another name. But, and it's still not a subject people want to engage with or talk about, even though there is a strong body of political interest in the broader subject of income inequality. We just are defining it in a way that doesn't seem to mention the people really at the bottom. And that's a fascinating dilemma about how you get people to talk about problems in politics. And I still do hold my 1991 position that I think it's good to talk about problems.
Yes. I was going to come back there. I'm glad you did.
Hope springs eternal.
Yeah, it's okay. Let's take a couple more. And yes, sir.
As a student of Marist in 1976, I had the distinct pleasure of studying the Ford-Carter election and learned so much about the Electoral College and the impact it had on that election. And I've watched all of the presidential elections since then with that same interest. And what I'm asking is, as we look to 2016, and does the Electoral College stack the deck in favor of either the Democrats or the Republicans? And in your opinion, is it time to change that method that's certainly built into our democracy?
So if you look at, I don't know if this is stacking the deck, but let's start with this. Started in 1992, every Democratic president, every Democratic presidential candidate, winner or loser, has carried 242 electoral votes. Okay? So you can sort of argue that since 1992, they've had a base of 242, which is close to 90% of the electoral vote. Take every Republican candidate for president since 92, they've all carried, right? This means winner, loser, 102 electoral votes, right? So they start off at 33, 34%.
To getting to 270.
To get to 270, right? So we know 270 is the number you need to get. To the demographic point, if we take off some of the biggest numbers away from the Republicans, namely a place like Texas or Georgia or Arizona, which are moving to be minority-majority states, then Democrats have a lock on the Electoral College. However, that suggests that Republicans are never going to be able to compete with this changing demographic. And what I think about when you look at what the Electoral College, in some ways, the downside is a handful of states get all the attention. Nobody else gets attention paid to them. We saw it in turnout numbers. Those battleground states had higher turnout than non-battleground states. So it affects people's thought that their vote matters, clearly. That said, the battleground states shift over time. And if Republicans are going to be a national party, they can't just cede some of these states. They can't just decide that, well, we haven't won in Michigan in forever, or we really can't win in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania we've always tried and we can't. They have to be able to be successful there, and then these new growing purple turning blue states like Colorado and Virginia as well. If we went back pre-1992, we would have the same discussion about how Republicans had a lock on the Electoral College. So it goes in these waves like this, but demographics being a big piece for that.
So does it work? I mean, does the process work?
I like it.
It only works when you get two different results and one person winning the popular vote and the other person winning the electoral vote. And of course, we've had those kind of black swan type of elections rarely, but when it does happen, people do want to say, well, we should just go to popular vote. Why isn't it that way? Why do we have an electoral college? Just to Amy's point, though, what happened in 1992? California ended up going Democratic, and it hasn't gone back, and I don't think anyone's ever going to say that California is a presidential battleground state, and that is fundamentally recast where I think Democrats have the electoral college advantage, because if you give them California and you give them New York, Republicans can counter with Texas, but then when Florida becomes a jump ball between the two parties, 3 out of 4 times the Democratic Party is going to end up winning. And then to the demographic point, if somehow Texas becomes competitive, I don't think it's going to happen now, but if it happens in 2020 or 2024, in the current way that you look at politics, it's very hard for the Republicans.
As Lee knows, I wrote a book a few years ago about the U.S. Constitution, and in that book I suggested the Electoral College should be bronzed as a memorial to one of the great moments in American history, the writing of the Constitution. I still think that's a good solution.
Okay, that's good. Jennifer. First time I've ever called you Jennifer. Netchie.
I know. Hi, Jennifer Netchie, Deneen, class of 1993. I'm glad we got to the 1992 election because I've been thinking about a trip that Lee and Barbara took some students on in fall of 1991. Nancy was with us too as we hoofed around DC talking to political journalists about the 1992 presidential election, and almost nobody talked about Bill Clinton. There's one or two. I think he was maybe in the, if we really pressed, like who's the third tier of possible Democrat? So as I was looking at all of the pictures, you know, we're not talking about any Democrats other than Hillary, and we're talking about some Republican names that have been around, but who should we be looking for? Who aren't we talking about that we should be watching?
Well, we haven't talked about Martin O'Malley, the governor of Maryland, very impressive candidate, would very much like to be president, has been building up shits all over the country. He's raring to go. You have a governor here in New York State, I'm told, is moderately interested in the presidency and has, we keep putting him in the McClatchy-Marist poll for some reason. I think there's a whole slew of governors out there. We didn't have Susana Martinez of New Mexico on the screen for the Republican field. We keep putting Sarah Palin in because we get a lot of web traffic off Sarah Palin, but we can probably push a few of those out. I think there's a lot of candidates out there, and I think the 92 election is the perfect example of why I think we shouldn't put too much stock in Hillary Clinton yet. And I always say she's the leader for the nomination. I don't think it's inevitable she'll even win the nomination because of the 92 example, although it was her husband who was the beneficiary of the flip side of that.
The one difference is that the way that we all, in the media, and everyone in this audience here, is talking about presidential contests and how fast it's expedited. In that 1992 race on the Democratic side, it percolated very late. It allowed someone to kind of come in at the last moment. I was reading an article just a couple of days ago about how there might be the possibility of a brokered convention on the Republican side where everyone is, you know, we've already taken a big deep dive into 2016 where we've kicked the tires on a lot of these people. And it's very possible that one of the people that we haven't kicked the tires of might end up becoming the next president in 2016. But everything is happening so fast now, and so we're giving a whole lot more scrutiny. In a lot of ways, you look at Hillary Clinton, and the news organizations are doing investigative pieces, going through her Little Rock papers or going through her presidential papers. Those are things that in past times that people would do when there was an actual presidential race that was happening, and we haven't even gotten through 2014 yet, and a lot of us and a lot of our brains are already wired on 2016.
And we'll be polling it. We'll take one last question, and then we have one more for the panel, which I reserve because I'm a co-moderator.
Anthony Bellantoni, class of 87. Do you think that it would be wise for term limits to come into Congress, and who? And if it is, who has that power? Is it the states or is it the Congress themselves?
I don't know who has the power.
You know, there was a 11th Amendment or 12th Amendment to the Bill of Rights that included term limits, which was rejected at the time.
It's state-based. It's state-based. And,
You know, One thing that's worth talking about term limits. It's hard to know what it would do to Congress per se, but there is a lot of experience and knowledge now about what term limits do at the local level, and it's almost all the unintended consequences that turn out to be exactly the opposite of what the public wanted. Because what term limits do at the level of a city council or a local legislature is they increase the power of lobbyists, they increase the power of the non-elected bureaucracy, and they reduce the influence of the actual elected officials. So I realize, and your poll today said that the country really would just like to replace everybody in Congress, so there's a kind of instinct to want to have something like term limits. But there really is an argument that they do exactly the opposite of what you think they'll do.
The Republicans, when they took over the House in '94, the Newt Gingrich revolution, put in internal term limits for committee chairmen. And after a couple of years, they got rid of it because it wasn't working. They needed people to develop expertise.
Well, you're term limited, right? As president of the
White House
the White House Correspondents
Yeah,
Association?
I'm term limited. Yes, I've been elected to one term.
How's your power?
You can fill an ebbing away.
Not a lame duck yet.
You're not lame duck yet.
I just want to add one thing, though, about term limits, which is there's also this natural thing called elections, and we've had 3-wave elections in a row. And just a number to leave you with, but half of the Republican conference has been elected since George W. Bush left office, okay? So this is not, these things, and if you look at the United States Senate, half of the United States Senate will be in their freshman, or they'll be in their first term. They may not be freshmen in the traditional sense of their first year there, but they will be in their first 6-year term. So this is a new group of people, and part of when we talk about is Washington broken, the debate right now, especially within the Republican Party, is the old establishment, the long time, been there, follow the rules crowd, and the new guys coming in and saying, the way you guys did things, we're going in a different direction. And that's what term limits is supposed to be about too. So it's actually happening even without passing legislation.
That's a really good point. And in fact, from that point flows one other thought, which is if you were going to pick an issue, if your goal in life is to change the way Congress works and you wanted to pick an issue to really fight for, and an issue that politically seems almost impossible to achieve, you could pick term limits or you could pick districting. And if you picked districting, you would have and you succeeded, you would have a far greater effect on how Congress works than you would by imposing term limits.
Absolutely.
Okay. One of the reasons Barb and I have always included political journalists in everything we do, first of all, we like journalism. We like political journalism.
You're the 2%.
That's where the 2%.
Like Mark.
We'll weight that data next time.
Definitely not the 1%.
You're not
We'll get that up. But it really, I think, one of the things we've seen for our students, I mean, it really humanizes the process because they become you and you become real. And that's, I think, one of the benefits that we've had beyond polling on the educational side of things. So tell me we'll go down the line, your best and worst day as a journalist.
Oh, God.
Or as a Yankee fan.
I think the worst day was 9/11. I mean, we were in Washington. I was in Washington and working. That was a bad day because it was a bad day for everyone. Yeah. And I had to write an extra. Back then, we were still writing entirely for print, and papers were putting out extra editions. We had to write a first version in 11. I wrote it, and it was a very bad day.
Sometimes the best days are the days that on paper don't seem like they would be the best days, which was the New Hampshire primary in 2008, which every single, not to pick out any poll, not to jump on pollsters, but remember every single poll suggested that this was going to be a blowout. Barack Obama was on his way to being the nominee. Hillary Clinton was done. She had lost Iowa. I remember telling my staff, it's going to be an early night. Don't worry about it. We'll be out of here by 9 o'clock. And when you watched the numbers come in, when you started to hear from the campaigns and you thought, wow, this is why I cover politics, because even though we've overanalyzed and overpolled and picked through every little piece, voters can still surprise us, and that was an awesome, fun night. Loved it.
For me, the best day is every election day. And in some ways, when you work for a big news organization and you're covering so many different stories and it becomes politics is the one story that everyone really wants to care about, it's so much fun. And one of the things, we deal with so many different campaigns, and so the side that ends up winning, they go on to the White House or they go on to these big things, but there's the other side that ends up losing, and these people don't have jobs. And for those of us who really get to touch this big story and we get our jobs the next day regardless, is just an amazing kind of experience. And it's the one story that every American's talking about: who's going to end up winning the presidency or who's going to control Congress. And there is so much of a rush and a great feel, and we have exit polls that are coming up, and your mom or dad's calling saying, who's going to end up winning? And it's like, I can't tell you.
You tell your parents, come on.
But it is such a great profession. As much as we were talking earlier about the trust and people having their doubts about journalism and all institutions for that matter, but what great jobs we have.
It is a great life, and I've had a lot of great moments, but I have to tell you, one of the best was when I had the good sense to listen to Lee Marinoff in 1982.
Oh, stop.
When he told me that his poll of the Democratic primary showed that Ed Koch was probably not going to be the Democratic nominee for governor.
He never forgave me. You did, but
he didn't. But Mario Cuomo still remembers.
Yes, he does. And so does his son. I didn't let you have your best day.
It's an obscure thing back in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Just a city hall story about a family that was going to lose its home because of a bank error. I wrote the story, and they saved their home.
No.
See?
Nice. That's great.
Very nice. On that note.
Yeah, you can't beat that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.